Hello everyone, wishing you all a wonderful day. Today, we're going to discover the shocking truth behind Jack's family land crisis and the hidden real estate scheme that could change everything. Stay with us until the end for all the drama, emotion, and unexpected twists. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next videos. Under the cold fluorescent glow of the company office, Jack stepped inside, and the door eased shut behind him with a soft click that made the silence feel even heavier. Vin was already gone, leaving only Jack and Mrs. Thu in that tense, airless room. She stood near the table with her head lowered, shoulders tight, her whole body seeming to carry the weight of what had happened. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled with shame and exhaustion. She apologized for letting everything become so tangled, so painful, so hard to explain. Jack stayed quiet for a moment, fingers tightening around his phone as he forced himself to stay calm. His chest was tight, his thoughts racing. But when he looked at Mrs. Thu, he did not just see a business partner. He saw the woman he had called auntie for years, someone tied to his family by decades of trust and affection. So when he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "Auntie Thu, please calm down and tell me everything. I still trust you. To me, you are family." Those words seemed to cut through the frozen tension in the room. Mrs. Thu slowly lifted her face, her eyes rimmed red, and in them Jack could see gratitude, guilt, and relief all mixed together. The pressure in the office did not disappear, but something changed. The distance between them softened. Jack felt the burden pressing even harder now, not only because of the money involved, but because this situation touched something much deeper than business. It reached into the long friendship between his mother and Mrs. Thu, into memories built over years, into the fragile bond between families. He did not want to accuse her. He did not want anger. What he wanted was the truth. Mrs. Thu gave a small nod, though her hands were still shaking, and opened the folder she had brought. One by one, she placed documents on the table, spreading them carefully like pieces of a story she had been carrying alone for too long. Jack stepped closer, eyes fixed on the papers. In that instant, before he had even read everything, he knew this was the moment when everything would begin to shift. Worry for his mother dug deeper into his heart. He thought of her sacrifices, of the trust she had placed in this investment, of everything their family had poured into it. But even with all that fear inside him, Jack stood steady, like a man planting his feet before a storm. He looked up, and for a second, he and Mrs. Thu held each other's gaze. No more words were needed in that moment. It felt like a silent agreement that no matter how difficult the truth was, they would face it together. Outside, the shadows in the room stretched longer across the floor. Inside Jack's mind, uncertainty stretched just as far. And yet beneath all that pressure, there was still one small thread holding firm. Trust. Bruised, tested, nearly broken, but not gone. Mrs. Thu began explaining everything in a low voice. The two plots in Xuanvan, both residential land, had once represented hope. They were meant to be stable investments, something that could grow in value over time. But after new planning changes and rezoning complications, the land became trapped in a boundary dispute. It could not be handled the way they had expected. Procedures were stalled. The situation had become far more serious than anyone had imagined. She told Jack that she had gone south to raise money, Not to disappear, not to deceive anyone, but to try to protect the land from being sold off cheaply to outsiders. It had been a desperate attempt to preserve his mother's investment, not a betrayal. As she explained, her voice kept wavering, and Jack could hear how deeply this had weighed on her. He looked down at the papers, at the maps, the legal language, the numbers and stamps, and felt as if the ground under him was slowly giving way. The reality was colder and more complicated than he had hoped. "I'm very sad, Auntie," he said quietly. "My family has been deeply affected. The land is under planning now. We can't just withdraw the capital." His words came out heavy, thick with disappointment, but not anger. It was grief, more than anything else. Grief for the losses already happening and for the uncertainty ahead. Mrs. Thu lowered her head again, and this time tears slipped silently down her cheeks. Jack looked at her for a long second, then gently reached out and touched her shoulder. "But the most important thing," he said, "is the many years of friendship between you and my mother. Business always comes with risk, but that doesn't mean we turn our backs on each other." Something softened in Mrs. Thu's expression at those words. A faint glimmer of hope returned to her eyes, fragile but real. Jack was hurting too, but he refused to stand there and place blame on someone who was also suffering. What mattered now was finding a path forward, together. The room still felt heavy, but not as cold as before. Jack told her he would continue looking into the matter, that he would verify everything carefully and try to understand exactly what was happening. Mrs. Thu nodded again, and gratitude filled her tired face. Then she pointed to the map, her finger trembling slightly as it hovered over another nearby plot. "There is another piece of land behind this one," she said. "It belongs to a real estate company. They've contacted me many times. They want to buy both plots so they can control the entire Bridgehead area." Her words landed hard. Jack stared at the map, and suddenly the situation looked far more dangerous than a simple land dispute. This was not just bad luck or legal confusion. It felt deliberate, planned, like someone was trying to gather the entire area piece by piece. "So someone wants the whole zone," Jack murmured, his voice lower now. He could feel new pressure rising in his chest. He immediately thought of his mother, of how much she had put into this investment, how much she had risked. If powerful people were moving behind the scenes, then this was no ordinary problem. Mrs. Thu watched him closely, anxiety written all over her face, but there was trust there too. She seemed to be holding on to the hope that Jack would not abandon her, that he would help her face whatever was coming. Jack gathered the papers and held them firmly in his hands. "Please stay calm, Auntie," he told her. "The important thing now is that we stay in contact. I'll look into this carefully and find a way to resolve it as peacefully as possible." She clasped her hands together tightly and nodded, like someone holding on to the last stable thing in front of her. Jack took the full file and turned toward the door. His heart felt heavier than when he had entered. As soon as he stepped into the corridor, a cold draft rushed past him, making the long hallway feel like the start of something darker. It felt almost like a warning. But even with that chill running through him, Jack knew one thing for certain: he could not stop here. Not because of money alone, because of his mother, because of loyalty, because of truth. As the office door closed behind him, the sound echoed like a quiet promise. He would protect what was left. He would uncover what was hidden, and no matter how dark this situation became, he would keep moving forward. That evening, in the warm amber light of a quiet corner coffee shop, the tension had not left Jack's body, even if the setting tried to soften it. The low hum of conversation, the clink of cups, the smell of roasted coffee beans drifting through the air, none of it could ease the pressure sitting in his chest. He placed the stack of documents on the table and slid them toward Luan. "I met Mrs. Thu today," Jack said, keeping his voice low. "There's something important I need you to look at." Luan pulled the papers closer and began flipping through them with sharp, practiced eyes. He was not the type to panic quickly. The more complicated the situation, the calmer he usually became, and that steadiness was exactly why Jack had come to him. As Luan studied the maps, legal notes, and planning details, the lines in his face slowly tightened. After a long silence, he leaned back slightly and exhaled. "This bridgehead land in Xuanvan used to be extremely hot," he said. "If the zoning ever shifted toward commercial or residential expansion, the value would jump hard. A company trying to gather the surrounding land would make perfect sense. If they can control the whole area, they can shape the future project themselves." Jack's fingers curled tightly around his glass. Even before Luan said more, he could already feel where the conversation was heading, and it made his stomach knot. Luan lowered his voice even further. "I think this may be connected to Mrs. Hoa." Jack looked up immediately. "Mrs. Hoa?" Luan nodded slowly. "She's a major player in real estate. Once she sets her eyes on a piece of land, she goes after it aggressively, and usually the goal is the same: force pressure, take advantage of uncertainty, and buy at the lowest possible price." The words hit Jack like a blade, sliding straight into the center of his worry. In an instant, he pictured his mother. He saw the house she had mortgaged. He saw the company she had worked so hard to build. He saw the years of sacrifice behind every decision she had made. This wasn't just an investment anymore. It was everything his family had risked, now caught in a battle they had never truly seen coming. "She can't get trapped like this," Jack said, and despite trying to stay calm, his voice trembled slightly. Luan held his gaze and gave a firm nod. "I'll investigate it. Give me 2 days. I know people in the industry, and I can ask around without making too much noise. If there's a plan behind this, I'll find traces of it." Jack let out a slow breath. For the first time that day, it felt like someone else was helping carry the weight with him. The pressure was still there, but it no longer felt like he was standing alone in the middle of it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I need everything made clear. No guessing. No blind spots." "You'll have it," Luan replied. They sat in silence for a moment after that. Soft music drifted through the cafe, and the bitter scent of coffee wrapped around them. But Jack felt strangely distant from it all. Around him, people laughed, checked their phones, talked about ordinary things. Yet inside him, it felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into something deep and uncertain. Still, Luan's promise gave him something to hold on to. When Jack finally stood, he reached across the table and shook his friend's hand firmly. There was no need for many more words. Some friendships did not need speeches. They were strongest in the moments where loyalty showed itself through action. He stepped outside into the evening air, and the cold wind rushed across the street, sharp enough to sting. The city lights blurred past in streaks of gold and white as motorbikes moved through the road. But Jack's path ahead had never felt more focused. He had no answers yet, but at least now he had a direction. Later that afternoon, the mood shifted in a completely different place. Golden light poured over the garden, settling softly across the rows of strawberry vines. The air smelled sweet and clean, touched by soil, leaves, and ripe fruit. It was the kind of setting that made the world seem slower, gentler, almost untouched by the harshness of legal disputes and financial pressure. Jack sat beside Tien with a piece of sugarcane in his hand. He broke it cleanly, the crisp sound echoing through the calm space around them. For the first time all day, his breathing slowed. He told her everything. He told her about meeting Mrs. Thu, about the documents, about the truth finally coming into view. He explained how Mrs. Thu had gone south not to run away, but to find a way to protect the investment. He shared that the papers appeared legitimate, and that at least one fear had been lifted. Mrs. Thu had not betrayed his mother. As Tien listened, her eyes brightened with relief. "I'm so glad," she said. "From the beginning, I felt she wasn't a bad person." Jack smiled faintly. The tight knot inside him loosened just a little. The two of them chewed sugarcane together, and the sweet juice spread across his tongue. It tasted like childhood, like summer afternoons, like a version of life where problems were smaller and days stretched on without fear. That taste pulled old memories out of him before he even meant to speak them. He began talking about the afternoons from years ago, when the smell of boiling sugarcane syrup filled the air and everything felt simple. Days spent running across open fields, evenings that ended with sticky hands, dusty feet, and not a single heavy thought in his mind. Tien laughed softly and added her own memories, herding buffalo, cutting grass, helping outdoors until the sun disappeared. Her voice carried warmth, and the more they talked, the more the weight Jack had been carrying seemed to ease. He turned and looked at her more carefully. She had always been there, in the quietest ways, watering plants, caring for flowers, tending vegetables, offering presents instead of questions, never forcing comfort, just creating it naturally around him. That kind of care was easy to overlook in the middle of chaos, but now, in the late sunlight, he felt it clearly. "Even though things are difficult," Jack said, "at least now we know the truth, and there are still people willing to help." Tien nodded and passed him another piece of sugar cane. In that moment, surrounded by the rustle of leaves and the scent of strawberries, Jack felt something deeper than relief. He felt connection, the kind that asks for nothing, but still gives strength. Life was still messy. The land dispute was still unresolved. The pressure was still real. But somehow, this quiet companionship made it all feel more bearable. As the sun began lowering toward the horizon, they walked upward, along the path leading to the pomelo orchard. The ground rose gently beneath their feet, and sunlight filtered through the leaves above them, flashing across the path in warm, shifting patches. The air was rich with the fragrance of pomelo blossoms, sweet and fresh at the same time. They stopped beneath branches bent low with fruit. Jack reached up, picked a pomelo, and used a knife to slice away the peel. The rind came off in thin strips, releasing a citrus scent so bright it seemed to clear his mind. He separated a segment and handed it to Tien. She took a bite, and her face lit up instantly. "So sweet." Jack laughed. And for that brief moment, the tension that had followed him all day slipped away. Standing there among the trees, Tien began calculating possibilities. If the orchard were leased seasonally, or if the harvest were managed well toward the end of the year, it could generate real income. Not a fantasy, not a vague hope, but something practical, something that could genuinely support daily life. With this many trees, she said, glancing around, if they're cared for properly, this could bring in good money. Jack listened, and for the first time that day, hope did not feel abstract. It felt tangible. He imagined weekends spent there together, pruning branches, adding fertilizer, checking fruit, carrying baskets down the hill. Work, yes, but honest work, visible work, the kind where effort met reward in a way that made sense. "You can do it," he told her, "and I'll help." Tien looked at him, her eyes bright with determination, though there was still concern there too. The orchard was large. The work would not be easy. But already the image of a full harvest seemed to push aside some of that worry. They kept walking upward, stopping now and then to admire the younger orange trees, many of them already heavy with fruit. They talked about care techniques, pruning methods, soil, timing, and harvest cycles. It was such a simple conversation, yet Jack found healing in it. Among all that living green, the land dispute felt far away for a while. Not gone, but distant enough that he could finally breathe without feeling crushed. By the time they reached the last row of orange trees, the sun had deepened into a rich golden glow. Fruit hung heavy from the branches, glowing softly in the light. Jack picked one, peeled it, and separated a bright, juicy segment. "Try this," he said, handing it to Tien. "It's really sweet." She bit into it, and juice ran immediately from the corner of her mouth. Jack laughed, and she laughed too, wiping it away with mock embarrassment. The moment was so simple, so unguarded, that it loosened something in both of them. They sat down against the trunk of a tree, while the breeze moved gently around them, carrying the scent of blossoms and ripe fruit. Tien shared old gardening tips she had learned over time: when to fertilize, how to prune branches for heavier yields, how to keep the trees healthy through changing weather. Jack listened, not only to her words, but to the calm in her voice. The land issue was still there, like a cloud sitting somewhere beyond the hills. But here, for this short stretch of time, he had peace. He turned and looked at Tien again. She was still the same person who had stayed beside him without asking for recognition, who had offered quiet support instead of dramatic comfort, who had helped steady him simply by being present. Looking at her now, Jack felt something rise in him that he did not quite name, but could not ignore. "Thank you," he said softly, "for always being here." Tien smiled and brushed her fingers lightly over the skin of another orange. They stayed there a little longer, picking fruit, tasting slices, talking about small things: grilled sugarcane, homemade strawberry syrup, little pieces of ordinary life. The pressure had not disappeared, but it no longer felt like it was crushing him. Hope moved through that orchard like the breeze itself, slipping between the leaves, settling into each shared laugh, each simple exchange. At last the sun sank fully, and the gold faded into evening. They stood and began walking back down the hill with their arms full of fresh fruit. The path ahead was dimmer now, but Jack no longer felt as alone as he had that morning. Challenges were still waiting for him. Hard truths were still unfolding. But something had changed. Loneliness had lifted, and in its place were the things strong enough to carry him forward. Human connection, the quiet gifts of nature, and the simple faith that even after the darkest storms, peace could still return.